Hello. Welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folk tales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle, and I am happily reporting from Pepper World headquarters. Today, we are going to talk about Zoroastrianism. This is a religion which is considered one of the oldest monotheistic religions on planet Earth, possibly the oldest, and it is considered the godfather, if you will, of the Abrahamic religions, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. What's so crazy to me about Zoroastrianism is that I don't feel like I've ever heard anyone talk about it. I think about it a lot, though. And I discovered Zoroastrianism through my research and Wikipedia rabbit holes that I stay up at night going down. There is an episode of my podcast, I believe it's episode 26, where I talk about Christmas. And there is a little section of that episode where I mention Zoroastrianism and give a brief, summary, specifically because Zoroastrian priests are mentioned in the Bible. But we're going to touch on that today. But if you remember, I think a lot of us, at least once, have heard this story of the birth of Jesus and how either 3 wise men or 3 kings came to bring him gifts when he was born. They brought him myrrh and frankincense and something else. Was it gold? However, the original, in the Aramaic text, which is what the New Testament was written in, the official translation was magi. And a magi refers to a priest of Zoroastrianism. And I think it's something that we all take for granted as humans. And I think this is a symptom of colonization, but in every culture, regardless of what part of the planet you're living in, there has been so many cultures, religions, customs that have been the building blocks of our everyday life. And I think it's easy to get wrapped up in, cultural activities, whatever they are. And it's so easy to just not think about truly where something comes from. And so even before the existence of Christianity, understanding the religions that came before it and how Christianity really kind of filled those shoes in, maybe took it a different direction, maybe, drove the car somewhere else. But they didn't necessarily invent the wheel. I also have just been thinking a lot about human culture from, as violent as humans can be, I really think humans are so fascinating and have such redeeming qualities. And I think one of the most redeeming qualities of human beings is kindness and love and creativity. And I'm so disappointed that human beings are still waging war upon each other and actively participating in genocides and slavery and exploitation. It really just sucks. And from a modern and ancient perspective, I'm so sad how much human culture has been erased in the past through colonization, and how much human culture is being erased right fucking now through war and colonization. And we're going to kind of talk about this throughout the story, but I just want to start the episode by saying this, that one of the most systematic strategies in colonization is to destroy ancient relics, be it libraries with ancient scriptures, be it buildings that were built for religious or cultural reasons, be it cities. And this is a colonization strategy that has existed for thousands of years. But I just think it's something we all need to pay attention to. And it's something that's been happening a lot in the last 50, 60, 100 years. There has been systematic destroying of certain ancient capitals on the planet, ancient libraries, and religious buildings. And a lot of those places are being destroyed right now, specifically in Palestine and Lebanon. But it's also happening and has happened all over planet Earth. It has happened all over planet Earth. And I think it's something that we have to remember. We desperately have to remember, because all of Earth's history is human history. Lebanese history is human history. Palestinian history is human history. Everything, every part of humanity is important for us to remember and understand. And hopefully we don't keep repeating these mistakes. So, without further ado, let's talk about Zoroastrianism. First of all, please drink water today. Thank you. I really appreciate you staying hydrated, and I'm really proud of you. Okay, so Zoroastrianism is a religion, and in a lot of ways, it's also kind of a philosophy. And so the essence of this religion revolves around a man who is known as Zoroaster, aka Zarathustra, aka Zarathustra Spitama. Most likely the name Zoroaster is like a Greekification of his name, which was most likely something more like Zarathustra. But I am going to call him Zoroaster in this episode simply because the religion is now referred to as Zoroastrianism, and so I think it will be easier to follow. So Zoroaster, obviously, is the spiritual founder of Zoroastrianism, and he was considered a reformer of the greater ancient Iranian area who challenged the tenets of the ancient Iranian religious culture. And so just for some context, before Zoroastrianism, the greater Iranian area, and I'm not calling this area Persia yet because it is believed that Zoroaster was born before the start of the second millennium BC, and this was slightly before what we consider the Persian Empire to have begun. But just to paint a picture of this part of the world, he was thought to be born somewhere in the greater Iranian area, but possibly even as far east as Afghanistan. And by the height of the Persian Empire, which really started kind of kicking into gear around the year 500 BC, we see, hold on, I'm getting all mixed around. We see that Persia at one point spanned as far east as Afghanistan and Pakistan, and even into border areas of China that are directly north of Kashmir in India. And at certain points, the Persian Empire spanned as far west as parts of Greece, huge parts of Turkey, and as far west as Libya on the African subcontinent, which then, of course, would include Egypt. And I think it can be hard to see. I highly recommend you Googling the Persian Empire, because it's kind of insane how big this part of the world, how big this empire really was. And Iran is kind of dead center. It's the biggest, it's kind of a big chunk in the center of this giant empire. And so before the birth of Zoroastrianism, this part of the world was still practicing more ancient religions based on what kingdom they were from. But of course, the biggest religions at this time were the Babylonian religions and the Mesopotamian and Sumerian religions. All were very similar. And I think a good way to think of it is if you know very much about let's say ancient Greece, there was a lot of similar beliefs, and maybe different kingdoms would have different patron gods that they would pray to. And a lot of this ancient world in the greater ancient Mesopotamian civilizations really revolved around the pantheon known as the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are very broad and controversial pantheon of gods. There are many theories that they are in fact aliens. That's a whole other thing that we could get into, but in a nutshell, in the ancient Mesopotamian and Sumerian culture, there was no word for religion. And in their written history, they talked about a group of beings that descended from the stars and gave them the gift of writing, reading, mathematics, architecture, you name it. And these beings were known as the Anunnaki, which translates to from those who came from heaven. Also, the king of this pantheon was named Anu, which also means heaven. So Anunnaki can mean two things: those who are the descendants of the god Anu, and those who are descendants of heaven. So, not to get fully off topic, but I'm just kind of setting the scene for you that now in the early and middle Bronze Age, so this is before the year 2000 BCE, we are in the ancient world of the greater Iranian area in the Mesopotamian, Sumerian, and Babylonian kingdoms. And people, for the most part, are still worshiping these gods, which they believe came from the stars. Gods like Enki, gods like Enlil, gods like Ishtar, and gods that had very similar gods, basically the same gods with different names and slightly different practices. And there was just a whole lot of what Christians would consider pagan worship, So it was like an ununified religious world. But I just want to mention again that fascinatingly, at this point, the people did not have a word for religion. So I'm just throwing that out there. Okay, so Zoroaster is born, and it's unclear exactly when he was born, but it's believed that he was born sometime in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE by some historians. However, most historians believe that he lived in the 2nd century BC. So this is basically 4,000 years ago from us. We are 2,000 years after the year zero, and he was living most likely 2,000 years before the year zero. So that's just some perspective. He became such a legend that he was an inspiration for Greek philosophers, including Heraclitus, Plato, Pythagoras, and like I mentioned, he is considered to be the godfather of the Abrahamic religions, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as other religions that are not commonly practiced to this day, such as Manichaeism and other philosophies. And a lot of those kind of sub-religions also gave a lot of cultural inspiration and influence to the Abrahamic religions. Zoroaster is considered a preacher, a poet-prophet, a sage, a wonder worker, and a philosopher. And Some people believe that when he was born in perhaps Afghanistan or Tajikistan. But again, a lot of details about his life are unknown because a lot of it is not mentioned in the scriptures, and this happened so long ago. So just for some global context, because I think it's hard for us to know what the fuck was going on in the year 2000 BCE. And so at this point in time when we believe that Zoroaster was born, this is considered to be the Middle and the Late Bronze Age. So meanwhile, during that time on planet Earth, this was considered to be the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. One of the most famous pharaohs of this time was Amenemhat II. And shout out to episode 1. I actually talk about Amenemhat II because he is the pharaoh who was thought to have built the great Egyptian labyrinth, which is still undiscovered to this day. And at this point in the Egyptian Empire, Thebes was the capital for majority of the time. And meanwhile, in this time on planet Earth, one of the most powerful civilizations was, of course, still in the Iranian subcontinent. And here we see the development of the alphabet, the greater use of the chariot, and we see huge migrations of people migrating onto the Iranian plateau and the Indian subcontinent. And because of the use of the chariot, we see a lot more wars happening, specifically between Grecian empires, Cappadocia, which is like the Turkish subcontinent, onto the Iranian subcontinent. So we see kingdoms growing, we see chariot warfare popping off, and by the year 1000 BCE, the world population grows to about 50 million. So this is a really emerging time of human civilization on Earth. Things are kind of growing rapidly, populations are growing, technology is growing. Reading and writing is becoming more accessible, of course, because when you transfer out of a cuneiform alphabet into a more easily readable alphabet, it becomes easier to become literate. And that's something that I think a lot of us take for granted, living at a time where literacy is expected. It's so much easier to be literate when you could theoretically be self-taught. You could really teach yourself to read, using the alphabet. And the alphabet that we use today is designed to be pronounceable, meaning, every letter symbolizes a sound. And so by understanding what sounds a letter represents, you could theoretically read something without even knowing what it means. Whereas in a lot of ancient cultures, and even to this day, there are some languages that it's so much harder to learn to read. Let's say if you have characters where a single character could mean a word or an entire concept. Or, of course, we often think of hieroglyphs from Egypt. This makes it a little bit more complicated to learn to read because one would truly need a teacher. And they would need the cultural context to understand the vast meaning of a specific word. Okay, so I'm just kind of I could talk about this forever, but I'm really just trying to paint the scene of what the ancient world looks like and the kind of world that Zoroaster was born into. So when he was born, people were still worshiping gods depending on what city or area they were in. And war is really starting to become a bigger topic, as well as large migrations of people throughout the area he was born. And interestingly, let's just say that he was living in Afghanistan or Tajikistan. This would be due east of Iran, and this is when we see huge groups of people migrating to both India and Iran. So he would kind of be in a middle ground of an area where large populations of people were migrating. So this would be a very interesting time to be alive. You would probably be exposed to a lot of different people who had been from different cultures or villages or cities who were moving, for a new life. And so in a weird way, now we think of this as such a remote part of the world, but you truly might be exposed to more than most people at this time. Okay. So, before the Arab Muslim conquest of Iran, which happened around the 7th century AD, or I guess now we say CE, like Common Era. So this is basically 7 centuries after the year 0. Zoroastrianism was considered the most prominent religion in the greater Iranian area for little over 1,000 years. Let that sink in. So basically, when Zoroastrianism really started hitting its stride as far as having a huge amount of followers, this was around the 7th century BCE. And it wasn't until the 7th century CE that we started seeing huge declines due to the Arab Muslim conquest of the Iranian subcontinent. And so just let that sink in. That's over 1,000 years of this being the most popular religion on planet Earth. That's monumental, right? And I just feel like no one ever talks about it. And it's just so fascinating to me because this part of the world as well is kind of straddling two very different areas, going as far east as India and as far west as Libya and parts of Greece. Like, that's monumental. That's wild, dude. So, what is known about Zoroaster comes from the scriptures. And a big part of the scriptures are written in a poetic form, in actual hymns. And these are known as gathas. And gathas are thought to be written by Zoroaster himself. And these were written in the ancient and native language of the area known as Avestan. And what's so interesting actually about this language known as Avestan is that we don't know what the native speakers of this language actually called their language. The reason why it's called Avestan comes from a Zoroastrian word, which is Avesta. And Avesta refers to Zoroastrian scriptures. There's I think a specific book in the Zoroastrian scriptures known as Avesta. And so even this ancient language that we call Avestan comes from Zoroastrian culture. And it's because some of the best kept literature we have of this ancient language are Zoroastrian texts. And I just really want to hammer home how big this religion was, that now even some of our understanding of the culture at this time really revolves around Zoroastrianism as the center point of our window into their ancient world. Interestingly, this language, Avestan, is very similar both grammatically and in the lexicon to Vedic Sanskrit. And Avestan is the oldest preserved Indo-Aryan language that is known to historians. What? What's fascinating actually is how many crossovers and similarities there are in specific words throughout Zoroastrian lexicon. And so that's something I never really thought of or considered, how much crossover there was in the ancient world in both culture but specifically language. And I really actually never knew that Sanskrit had like a sister language. And you can look up Avestan, It, in a lot of ways, you can see its influence on Arabic. And when you look at the language, it also kind of reminds me of Hindi. Hindi, and it kind of reminds me of Thai. But the calligraphy style is very clearly more in the style of when you think of Arabic, with these kind of long tails behind the words or in front of the words. Okay, so it is believed that the name Zoroaster directly translates into he who can manage camels, or possibly other variations, such as he who ages with camels, he who is with aging camels, he who is with furious camels, who desires camels, and who is driving camels. So there's obviously a lot of slight variations in what Zoroaster means. However, camel is a big part of it. And of course, in the ancient culture of the Iranian plateau, camels were considered very precious animals, and they could walk very far with little water. And, obviously their humps can carry water from within. And interestingly, I found a lot of ancient art from the Iranian subcontinent that are clay figurines of camels with instead of a hump, having a water jug as their hump, with extra water jugs on the side of them. And so possibly the symbol of the camel can be thought of as the water bearer. And water is actually a really big part of Zoroastrian culture, as it is considered a pure element. And we're going to get into that shortly, but it is kind of, water was given as offerings to purify spaces and to purify self, similar to how holy water is used in the Abrahamic religions. And so it is possible that the name Zoroaster could be a symbol for being a beacon of strength in the hot desert, both as a literal meaning, but also an allegory of being a beacon of water, of purity in a world of lost people, a world of violence, a quote, a philosophical desert, So one interesting little factoid is that Pliny the Elder, who was a Greek philosopher, believed that there were, in fact, two Zoroasters. So he believed that one lived thousands and thousands of years ago, and that the second Zoroaster lived later in history and was present and accompanied Xerxes I in the invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Pliny the Elder is the only person who has made this claim. That doesn't seem to be a belief within Zoroastrianism itself, but I just thought it was a fun little factoid. And it's commonly believed that as Zoroaster became a man, that he lived in northeastern or eastern Iran. And most likely this is because in his scriptures he mentioned 17 regional names, and these would have placed him, it's assumed that he was living near where these regions he mentioned, and that would be in the northeast section of modern day Iran. So the first place that Zoroaster appears in our texts that we have places him on the banks of the Ditya River in Arianem Veha. And so this place, Arianem Veha, is, according to the scriptures of Zoroastrianism, is considered the homeland of early Iranians. And this is kind of like the first real thing that we know about Zoroaster. He appears in the scriptures on the banks of the Ditya River. And so it is said that Zoroaster was born from a father named Poroshashpa, and his father's name means possessing of gray horses, and his mother's name was Dugdao, which meant milkmaid. And it is said that he was the middle child of 5 boys, and that he began training as a monk by the time he was 7, and then he became a priest around 15. And the legend goes that he learned from many teachers, and once he was 20, he left home and began traveling. So this kind of brings us back to like the first real story we know about Zoroaster. I just feel like the need to burn some Palo Santo right now. So when he was about 30 years old, this is where the scriptures place him, on the banks of the Ditya River in the homeland of the ancient Iranians. And here he experienced a vision, a revelation during a spring festival. And in his vision, he saw a being which he calls Ahura Mazda, which translates to wise Lord. And Ahura Mazda showed him 5 other radiant godlike figures. And this sparked the beginning of him learning and working directly with this radiant being, Ahura Mazda. And Ahura Mazda taught him about the nature of reality itself. What's fucking crazy is that yesterday, I guess for 2 days, I did a bunch of research on this. And again, I actually just want to throw out there, I do all my own research, and this is a religion that's 4,000 years old. So I just want everyone to take that with a grain of salt. I'm one guy, and what I'm learning online that's been translated in English, like, I'm sure plenty of little tidbits have been left out and or changed through the last 4,000 years. I do not trust most of the historians throughout history, because history is always written by the victors of war. And so there's a lot of erasure that happens. I just want to throw that out there. Okay, so yesterday and the day before, I was doing all this research about Ahura Mazda and the Zoroastrian religion. And I personally find the Zoroastrian religion to be really interesting, and I really enjoy it. And so last night I had a dream that I saw Ahura Mazda as like this like globular piece of liquid gold, like floating in this realm of light. And it was like almost like acting like as a bacteria. It was like splitting itself and like joining itself back together, and it was like this globular golden consciousness. And in my dream I was like, oh sick, like now they're gonna let me into like the hidden temple. It was so bizarre. I just was like convinced that there was like some hidden Zoroastrian temple somewhere, and that because I was seeing this like golden deity that they were gonna let me in the temple. What? I don't know, dude. Pretty trippy over here. Things are getting pretty trippy in the world of Pepper. Okay, so in a nutshell, what this being Ahura Mazda taught Zoroaster was that there was like 2 primal spirits of reality. One of them was Ahura Mazda, and the other one is known as Angra Mainyu, which translates to destructive spirit. So basically, like, Ahura Mazda is the wise Lord, but like quite simply is creation itself, whereas Angra Mainyu is destruction. And so the opposing spirit of Ahura Mazda is known as Druj, which is deception. And the opposing spirit of Angra Mainyu is Asha, which means order. So after this revelation, Zoroaster dedicated his life to be a teacher of Asha, which is order. So the idea of being able to teach this spiritual order is a way of opposing this destructive spirit, which is in this never-ending fight with divine order. So Zoroaster continued to see vision throughout his life, and eventually, with working with Ahura Mazda, was shown the 7 divine entities who emanate from Ahura Mazda, and they are known as the Amesha Spenta. And so these are like, I guess another ways that you could like phrase this are like the faces of God, if Ahura Mazda is God. Interestingly though, they never use the term God. Ahura Mazda is often like the closest thing to God is wise Lord, but it's most commonly referred to as the highest divinity. And it seems that Ahura Mazda really just is pure light. And I do like that because in the ancient religion, at least, this religion was not about worshiping or considering Ahura Mazda a master. It actually is about exhibiting kindness and order so that one does not become a force of destruction. It's almost about like aligning yourself with the highest divinity, which is kindness and light, so that you may like help them grow brighter, which I think is kind of a beautiful sentiment instead of like worshiping, which I think worshiping often kind of becomes like blindly lowering yourself in the face of something that you perceive as like hierarchically better than you, right? Okay, so anyway, these 7 entities which emanate from Ahura Mazda are the Amesha Spenta. So the first one is called Spenta Mainyu, which means the holy mentality or the creative spirit. There's the Vohu Mana, meaning good purpose. Asa Vahista, meaning best truth or righteousness. There's the Zausora Vaira, meaning desirable dominion. The Spenta Armaiti, which means holy devotion. The Haurvatat, which means wholeness. And the Amaretat, which means immortality. Interestingly, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing these like perfectly, but these words do kind of remind me of certain Sanskrit words or even words in like Gujarati or these words, like I can almost hear them being said in Hindi. So I'm going to list these again just with the English translation just to like summarize, because I know it can be a lot to hear all these words in languages that we don't speak. So basically these 7 divine entities, there's the holy mentality, good purpose, best truth / righteousness, desirable dominion, holy devotion, wholeness, and immortality. And again, these are the emanations of Ahura Mazda, who is considered the creator of all things. So after these qualities emanated from him, he created the material and visible world to ensure and isolate destruction. That's actually pretty crazy. So like really what they're saying is the world that we live in was created to isolate this destructive force. So according to Zoroaster, Ahura Mazda created a floating egg-shaped universe in 2 parts. First, of course, the spiritual world, and then eventually 3,000 years later, Ahura Mazda created the physical world. And I just think it's really interesting that it is described as an egg-shaped universe, because according to a lot of ancient traditions, the shape of a human soul is egg-shaped, which mimics the shape of our universe. And I just think it's a really interesting detail that this is also mentioned in Zoroastrianism. So Ahura Mazda taught Zoroaster the cardinal principles of, like, quote, good religion. And these are the principles which created the teachings of Zoroastrianism. So the kind of like a nutshell of good religion is kind of about what I was mentioning, which is like understanding this dualism in reality, that there is a creative energy and a destructive energy. And this destructive energy, Angra Mainyu, is thought to be born from, quote, evil thoughts. And evil thoughts are known as Aka Mana. And that goodness comes from Ahura, which is wisdom. And so Ahura Mazda created spirits known as Yazatas to aid him. So there are, according to Ahura Mazda, there was other gods that existed, but a lot of these gods, in what he explained to Zoroaster, did not deserve worship. And these were known as devas. And these devas had been created by the destructive spirit. I find this really interesting too, because there is a lot of conjecture about if Zoroastrianism is monotheistic or polytheistic. And what's interesting is that they only report or let's say worship Ahura Mazda, but there is this belief that other gods exist. They're just possibly mischievous and don't deserve worship. And I think that's worth noting. I also think it's just really interesting. And what I kind of respect about Zoroastrianism is that even when referring to Ahura Mazda, there doesn't seem to be this sense of hierarchy. Ahura Mazda is simply a creator spirit that by existing you align yourself with. And I'm sure you can actually hear like the similarities that I think a lot of the Abrahamic religions tried to align themselves with. And I think like culturally over time, religion just became a lot more cult-like and a little bit more like worship-oriented and like worship your king kind of energy. And from what I understand, in some cultures that still practice Zoroastrianism, they may or may not have kind of assimilated to a similar style of like praising Ahura Mazda as the eternal ruler. But in the ancient scriptures, there's never talk about him being a ruler or like punishment being used. He's simply like a being of light who emanates creation. So, according to Ahura Mazda, all misery in the universe stems from the destructive spirit. And to be a human means that you have the choice between Asha, which is truth and cosmic order, and Druj, which is falsehood and deceit. And so through falsehood and deceit, these express themselves as greed, wrath, and envy. And the major and most important principle of living is to be a force of truth and righteousness. And I actually like kind of love that. I mean, I think the word righteousness now, like even the term righteous in our modern world has become perverted with major religions. But just the idea of like the most important principle of life being truthful really resonates with me, because I have a saying. It sounds like so cheesy, but I always say the truth, honesty will set you free. And it sounds so trivial and simple, but when you are honest all the time, something changes in your life. I'm telling you, it's like magical. And when you are fully honest all the time, I I feel like your words hold more gravity. Your words become real. And from like a magical perspective, like I think you become like a more powerful manifester because you don't speak without meaning it. And in my experience, I had some childhood trauma that I bottled up inside me for so long, and I never talked about it. And when I started talking about it, a shift happened in my life where I just stopped hiding things or like telling white lies or whatever. And I just noticed like energetically a huge shift happened in my life, and it was easier for me to manifest things really quickly. And so I really do stand by that the honesty will set you free. One thing though that I love about Zoroastrianism is that regardless if one chooses to be truthful or deceitful, it is free will of every conscious being. It is the free will of every conscious being to choose what they want on a moment-to-moment basis, which I love. So, according to Ahura Mazda, the principles of being a force of truth and righteousness are three things, and this is known as the threefold path. The threefold path starts with 1, good thoughts, and this is called Juanata. And then second is good words, which is Hakta. And the third is good deeds, which is Havarshta. So the idea being that by having good thoughts, one could speak good words and good intentions, and through that be able to carry out good deeds. And I think in English this sounds like, good thoughts, good words, but really this is about like pure thoughts, like thoughts of good intention, thoughts of like creative intention, and thoughts that are kind to all. And so the one who can master these three things, known as the threefold path, is considered a master of asha, or order, and they would be known as avashin, and that is someone who is a bringer of happiness into this world by keeping the cosmic order of creation itself. And so subsequently in Zoroastrianism, charity is considered to be a core belief in spreading happiness. And that actually does kind of remind me of early Christianity, and a big reason why early Christianity spread so fast was because how adamant they were about charity and kindness to all people, regardless of social status or whatever. And in a time in the world where there was empires that were killing groups of people and going to war and stealing land, to find a safe place, a safe church where you could have a hot plate and food and feel loved, like of course you would want to be a part of that, And it does really, to me, feels like it is inspired by this Zoroastrian idea that charity is an important aspect of spreading happiness, and that spreading happiness is a core belief in their religion, which I love. And a really, really big aspect of this belief was that true goodness transpires for those who do righteous deeds for the sake of righteous deeds and not in search of reward. And I also vibe with that, And I think that's also like a really big issue that I have with like modern day religions. Like I do feel like I've read a lot of scriptures and I get what they're trying to say, but like you're not necessarily a kind person if you're doing things expecting a result. That's the opposite of kindness. That's manipulation. But to be kind for the sake of it is kindness, right? And that's that's a really big cornerstone of Zoroastrianism. According to Ahura Mazda, it is each person's responsibility to find Asha, which is the divine order, after becoming unaligned with hatred. So like if, let's say you live a life where deceit and hatred affect you, only you can change that. It is your personal responsibility to find your way out of that. And one thing we love about Zoroastrianism is that Ahura Mazda made very clear that there is spiritual equity between men and women. And then Zoroastrian belief that there is no hierarchy between men and women. Sadly, though this is a core belief, most priests were men, and from what I understand with parts of the world that still practice Zoroastrianism, there still is very much sexism. And I think that speaks more on just like the global human culture. Sexism is like a huge epidemic that's been happening for thousands of years, and it's like really speaks to how deep it is, because even if you practice a religion that insists that men and women are equal, you can still have a culture that is like they just won't allow it, right? That's something I just think about this so much. It is so crazy. With the scriptures that I have read, I think, most of the scriptures that I've read have been of the Abrahamic religions. And it is just so wild to me how the practices that I've seen of practicing Christians or practicing Jews or practicing Muslims don't always reflect the scriptures that I've read, which are usually about kindness to others, kindness to strangers, and kindness even to those that you would consider an enemy. A lot of them are about radical kindness, and with this idea that like only God can judge you, and that like you genuinely can't judge others. And yet a lot of the individuals or like larger groups of people that I've seen who practice such religions often are carrying out wars and are shunning and judging. And I think that this is more of like I think it speaks more to human nature and the nature of what I would consider fear. I think fear of things that are unknown and fear of things that pose, an imaginary danger to you makes people act in all kinds of ways, and it's kind of what spurs violence. But it's just kind of deep that even you can even practice a religion and tell yourself that you live by the words of these scriptures, and like you really don't. I do find that really fascinating. And so this is actually another really interesting fact about Zoroastrianism, is that Zoroaster was very clear that he was not for extreme asceticism, meaning that like to live the life as a monk in full isolation of humanity was not encouraged. So even if one was a priest, it was emphasized that you were to live your life in society, in community, because your deeds in your life and your actions in your life within human society were of the utmost importance, because really it is about kindness and charity for each other. And to like be a true practitioner of Zoroastrianism is to like spread happiness within human society. And again, I think I mentioned this before, but I love that there's a huge stress that there is no predestination in life, and that free will of all conscious beings is a fact. This is a free will universe according to Zoroastrians. And even divine beings, devas, and these emanations of Ahura Mazda, all of them have free will. And humans bear the responsibility for every moment in their life and every situation that they are in, of how they respond and how they react. And I fucking vibe. I actually kind of love Zoroastrianism, at least like in theory, I'm liking what Ahura Mazda / Zoroaster are putting down. This really speaks to me. So this is some interesting lore. So it is believed in Zoroastrianism that before a child is incarnated, their soul is still united with what is called Fravashi, which basically means your personal higher spirit. And so maybe in English we would say your higher self. So it is believed that your higher self, quote unquote, aka the Fravashi, has existed since Ahura Mazda created the universe. So before your higher self splits off to incarnate into this baby, the higher self aids Ahura Mazda in the making of the body and the life of this future child. Isn't that fascinating? And the higher self can act as an inspiration to carry out good deeds, as well as the higher selves of the ancestors and the cultures of that person. They can be called upon for help in any given time, almost like guardian angels. I really also resonate with this part of the religion. I think it's really interesting that there is a distinction between your soul that's incarnated in your body and then the higher self. And interestingly, Zoroastrians don't believe in reincarnation, but they do believe that your higher self will have other lives. And that's actually something that I also resonate with, because I do think, I for lack of a better term, I do believe in reincarnation, but I do really like how it's phrased here in Zoroastrianism, because basically according to their beliefs, the soul that you have right now, let's use me as an example. The soul that I have as Annabelle is like a once in a lifetime thing. I'll never be Annabelle again. And the soul that occupies Annabelle won't be the same. So let's just say that I will quote unquote have a future life. That future life will be born from my higher self, but it's going to be a different portion of the soul. And that kind of plays into this idea I've always had that your higher self could actually have multiple lives at the same time, bigger than just past lives and future lives. There can be simultaneous realities where you're living as many things at the same time, and that your past lives and future lives are happening at the same time. But even on the same time on the planet, you could have multiple lives. That's just me. Those are just kind of things that I think about based on my experience with meditation, and past life regressions I've done, that time is less of a linear experience, and it's more of a fabric. It's mad trippy. Anyway, I do really think a lot of these concepts are really interesting, and I find them to be so cool. So another really big part of the collected scriptures of Zoroastrianism, which are known as the Avesta, they call upon protection with the use of water, earth, fire, and air. And fire particularly is considered to be sacred, as it is a symbol for Ahura Mazda. And many of the places that Zoroastrians worship were actually known as fire temples. And so according to later descriptions of the Iranian cultures that were recorded by many Greeks and people from the Roman empires, talked about fire temples, which were often domed buildings that had a fire endlessly burning, and that the Zoroastrian priest's job was to literally feed the fire. And many of the Zoroastrians who would come to pay their respects would bring fragrant wood or beautiful pieces of wood to burn in these fires, which were this symbol of Ahura Mazda. So those are kind of that's the major meat of what Zoroaster taught. And this kind of all happened from his visions that he started having after this spring festival. So as he started teaching his findings, he started gaining popularity really fast. And by the time Zoroaster was 42, he received patronage from a queen known as Queen Hutausa. and a ruler known as King Vishtaspa. And they were known to live in an ancient city known as Kashmar, which was allegedly around 200 kilometers from modern day Baghdad/Babylon. And little are known about these rulers, and some historians believe that they are mythical. However, they may have been real, especially because at this point in time, many places in the greater Iranian area had smaller kingdoms, like city-state kingdoms. So, nonetheless, according to the scriptures, these rulers are described as agreeing to spread the message of Zoroastrianism. And specifically, the king Vishtaspa was called a patron and ally of Zoroaster. And the legend goes that after King Vishtaspa converted, that Zoroaster brought back a branch of a magical cypress tree of legendary beauty and gargantuan proportions. And this tree became known as the Cypress of Kashmar. And it was planted in front of the palace of King Vishtaspa. So it is said that the tree, I got that wrong. It wasn't planted in front of the palace. It was planted in front of the first fire temple. And sadly, according to legend, that later during the Islamic Caliphate, the tree was cut down and used in building a palace in Babylon. And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier. Like, through colonization, we often destroy ancient culture, and systematically we destroy symbols of importance to ancient cultures, like them cutting down that tree was purposeful and symbolic. They purposely cut down a tree that had so much ancient importance and used it to build the new palace. And we see that happening all over the world through colonization. Here in Mexico, the conquistadores dismantled pyramids and used them to build churches. It's the same fucking strategy. This is a strategy. And I think that's something that we don't take seriously enough. There are ancient strategies that humans have used to control populations, and because we don't study it enough, we don't realize it when it's happening. And it makes me sick. I hate it. I hate it. Okay. So, according to legend, Zoroaster lived a very long time and was known to have 3 wives throughout his life. And allegedly, from his 2 first wives, he had 3 sons and 3 daughters. And with his 3rd wife, he had no children. And according to scriptures, Zoroaster lived until the age 77 years and 40 days, which is very specific. So some versions of his death claim that he was killed by a priest of the old Babylonian religion, or the Sumerian religion. And this priest was known as Karapan. Oh, sorry. The religion was known as Karapan. And the name of this priest was Bradres. And in this version, Bradres killed Zoroaster in front of an ancient religious altar to this ancient religion. There's another version of the story that say that Zoroaster was killed by a Turanian soldier named Baraturish. But both stories feature a very similar symbol, and that symbol being that Zoroaster is believed to have been killed by a powerful man of the older traditions of the Iranian subcontinent. And who's to say what really happened? But I do think, thematically, everyone wants their Messiah to have been murdered. There's something about it that, it really gets the masses going. It's almost like sports, like give the masses what they want. They want a murder for the Messiah. It just really adds the drama. Humans love drama. So, like I mentioned, Zoroastrianism became the most practiced religion in the world for about 1,000 years. And a big part of those religious practices revolved around their act of worship, which is known as yasna. And yasna literally translates to worship. And interestingly, it is related to the Sanskrit word, which is yajna, which means the ritual performed in front of a sacred fire. Would you look at that? Isn't that fucking crazy? It's so crazy to me how many crossovers there are. So, yasna is a ceremony that is designed to strengthen the orderly and spiritual and material creations of Ahura Mazda against the assault of destructive forces. So basically, a priest would recite the texts. Sometimes, actually, a regular person would do this. Often, people would go to fire temples to do this, but a priest or a person would recite texts and give offering to the waters. So a lot of that was a little vague. I think from what I understand, there were some actually like offering waters to the fire, like sprinkling water on the fire, but also giving offerings to water itself. And this is kind of indicative of this idea of like holy water or like having water in the temple. This is kind of, it's very Abrahamic. So like I mentioned before, a lot of Zoroastrianism is written in these hymns or poems that were often sung, and these were known as gathas, and these are allegedly written by Zoroaster himself. And the idea was that by reciting these poems and giving an offering of water, that you are literally and symbolically keeping the universe moving in the direction of harmony and light and leading the world away from chaos. So there's almost like a spiritual alignment by reciting these. And interestingly, it reminds me a lot of ghazals, and they sound similar, gathas and ghazals. Ghazals are, from what I understand, they're a principal part of the Indian Islamic religion. I'm not sure if ghazals are a thing in other practices of Islam. But in a nutshell, ghazals are a really similar practice. They are like these spiritual poems that are sang in songs, and they're almost like mantras. Like the words and the melodies are designed to connect you with Allah and like align your body. They're so beautiful. I highly recommend you looking up ghazals. I'm pretty sure it's spelled in English, it's spelled Ghazal, ghazals. They're so beautiful, and they're usually in like Sanskrit or probably like a northern dialect, but I don't know. I can't speak on that. I'm not sure. Don't quote me. Okay, so the major act of these ceremonies, which were known as yasnas, was the act of strengthening of the waters, which was called absor. And it was common for people to practice the religion directly under the stars next to an open fire at night if there wasn't a nearby temple. And water and fire were considered the agents of ritual purity. It's literally so beautiful. I really vibe with this, dude. I kind of love Zoroastrianism. Interestingly, like some similarities to like Abrahamic religions is that like one principal belief in Zoroastrianism was that there was a heaven, but it had many layers. And so there was first the layer of stars, then there was the layer with the moon, the layer with the sun, and then eventually layers that had like spirit realms. And that they believed that after you died, that your soul spent 4 days before it moved on to the next realm. And they had a very interesting belief about keeping the earth pure because all of the elements were considered pure and sacred in their religion. So there was a practice when somebody died where they would put bodies, they would build towers or like circular walled structures. And they would put dead bodies out in direct sunlight for 4 days, and they would let birds and wild dogs like eat them. Which is kind of like brutal. And then after 4 days, they would like dip the body in wax and then bury them in order to not contaminate the earth. Okay, so like in a way, this does sound a little bit weird, but in another way, a big part of this was that like the idea was that they didn't want the body to contaminate water and earth, which is like what their food grew out of and what their water grew out of. And if you think about this like from a more natural perspective, like in the ancient world, most likely a human body would be like eaten a little bit before buried. So I'm not necessarily mad at it, right? Like get some meat off the bones and then bury it so that it's not like rotting underground where you like plant your potatoes, right? I don't know. It's kind of wild. And another really big part of this is that they believed that evil spirits and dark spirits were really attracted to freshly dead flesh. And so letting animals, specifically like, animals like vultures who are designed to eat dead flesh, keep the flesh from being used by like dark spirits. And so these towers that they would build to put these bodies in were known as the Towers of Silence. What's crazy is that when I was 19, I went to India and I spent 6 months there, and it was so fun. But literally on like my first week there, I was with a friend, but we ended up meeting a bunch of girls who were from like other parts of the world. They were like European. And one of them had found out about this place called Malabar Hill in Mumbai. And so we didn't like know anything about it. So we tried to take a taxi to Malabar Hill. And it's like quite a fancy part of town. And we were trying to find this like place where they would leave bodies out for the birds and rats to eat them. And like we thought we'd be able to see it. And then we learned that like outsiders are not allowed to look. But we saw this building. It was just like a wall. And I knew nothing about it. All I knew was that there was this like very rare temple that was like some random ancient religion where they would like leave bodies out for rats and birds to eat. And so I looked it up, and it's true. Malabar Hill is a Zoroastrian structure where Zoroastrians, to this day, some of them will still let bodies out to be eaten by birds and rats. Isn't that kind of crazy? For me, this was just wild because I was just like a kid being like, weird, people let bodies out to be eaten. And it like never occurred to me that it was from this ancient religion from the Iranian subcontinent that I actually like super vibe with. Like, what is life? Is this real life? Is this gonna be forever? But basically, in a nutshell, after like hundreds of years, a lot of Iranian Zoroastrians began cremating their bodies. And one big reason for that was that after the conquest of the Islamic Caliphate, of course, like Islam became the major religion of Persia. And at the time, body dissection was considered like illegal due to their religious beliefs, due through what we consider the medieval times of the Persian Empire. So because of that, actually, a lot of students who were learning medicine would actually break into the Towers of Silence, and they would steal cadavers so that they could like dissect them. And of course, like this kind of pissed off Zoroastrians. Another thing that kind of changed was that through the colonization of the Arab world, it became harder to be a practicing Zoroastrian, as of course they like used a lot of tactics to get people to convert, and we'll touch on that in a second. But there are stories of like war generals and high-ranking Muslims going into the Towers of Silence and using them for the call to prayer, and eventually taking the Towers of Silence completely and using them as towers for the call to prayer, which is pretty wild, kind of chilling. So now let's get into my favorite part, which are the Magi. The Magi, like I mentioned, are the priests of Zoroastrianism. But what's so interesting is that the Magi themselves have kind of become this like legendary and almost mythical group of people. And like I mentioned, like during the height of Zoroastrianism and also the height of like the Persian Empire, Persia was fucking huge. It was going as far west as Greece and Libya, and as far east as Tajikistan, India, Pakistan, like Afghanistan. Like it's huge. And so they became like really legendary all around the ancient world. And so according to many ancient cultures, Magi were sorcerers, astronomers, astrologers, alchemists, and scholars of esoteric knowledge. And they were believed to have shamanic abilities, and they could travel in the spirit world and into invisible realms. What? And they were known to use, as a part of their religious practices, fortified wine, a plant substance called hauma, and a plant substance called mung. So hauma is a divine plant from Persian mythology, and it is described as a tall, fragrant, and golden green plant, and it grows in the mountains and swiftly spreads. This plant is allegedly known to further healing, sexual arousal, physical strengthening, alertness and awareness, and nourishing the body, and it was known to have mild intoxicating effects. Sign me up. This plant sounds amazing. Haoma? It's spelled Haoma. Haoma, I think. And so most commonly, this plant would be either pressed into cakes or cooked into like a tea, and they would drink it. And interestingly, it is thought to be the same drink that's mentioned in Vedic scriptures known as soma. And then I mentioned three things, right? I mentioned they used fortified wine, haoma, and then the third was called mung. And this is a fun motherfucking fact. Mung is the same thing as bung, and bung is the Indian style edible. It is an incredibly strong edible, and it's kind of like the hash of edibles. They would like pulverize fresh weed into like pastes and press them into cakes, and then just cook them directly into edibles. So like bung fucks you up. I've tried bung, and bung gets me fucking ripped. Bung gets you fucking ripped. And so like literally these magi were known to travel the astral plane, be able to travel to invisible realms, and they were getting ripped off of weed and this really cool like haoma tea and fortified wine. Like, this is lit. Are you kidding me? I think I might have to convert to Zoroastrianism, dude. Um, so, like I mentioned, like at this point, as the Persian Empire is huge and before the conquest of the Arab Caliphate, like magi are being mentioned all over the world because they're kind of like, in a lot of ways, like the most spiritually advanced people in the ancient world that we, in this region. Of course, like the Americas are kind of like their own story, but in the Asian subcontinent and the North African and European subcontinent, like magi at this time are kind of like the hot girls on campus in the spiritual world. So that kind of brings me to like our most famous alleged story of them, which is mentioned in the Bible with the birth of Jesus. And so like the story is that there was 3 traveling magi who saw a sign in the stars that told them that there would be a new Messiah. And so they traveled for days to present gifts to this new baby, Yeshua, who now we call Jesus, which doesn't even make sense because there was no J in the Aramaic religion, but whatever. So, if Jesus was born around the time the Bible claims, this would have been a heightened time of Zoroastrianism and would have been the most popular religion practiced at the time. Hello, people. Hello. Why does no one talk about this? And so, I just want to bring up like a couple things that I find like interesting correlations to some of the Abrahamic religions. And obviously, like one could make correlations between Ahura Mazda and the God of the Bible and even Allah. But a lot of historians are like, a little tentative to say that Ahura Mazda and God are the same, because in the Abrahamic religions, Yahweh, God, Allah are considered to be a supreme God, whereas Ahura Mazda is simply a creator deity and all things emanate from it. But it's not like a ruling force, and it's never, it doesn't like speak or punish, if that makes sense. And interestingly, again, there's these Ahuras and these beings which emanate from Ahura Mazda, and these are kind of considered to be children of God, and like you could correlate them to angels. Blah, blah, blah. So then, of course, we have these gathas, and sometimes they're even called mantas, which are similar to the word mantra. They're considered prayer formulas, and one could correlate those to hymns from the Bible, and ghazals, which is what I mentioned before, which is a Islamic poetic prayer. And this idea of like Asha, which is this rhythm of reality and rhythm of order in the movement of the planets, the sunrise and the sunset. And that is kind of like a theme that's mentioned a lot in the Abrahamic religions, which is like God's will and all things being emanations from God itself. But one also interesting distinction is that this concept of Angra Mainyu, which is this symbol of destruction and chaos, it is never described as evil. It's simply destruction and nothingness. And it is in this constant dance with Ahura Mazda. But a lot of historians have been very clear that there is a big distinction with Zoroastrianism and the Abrahamic religions in like this moral context. The Abrahamic religions put morals into a lot of these themes of like good and evil, whereas Zoroastrianism is really more primordially about like order and chaos. So according to one historian, Zoroaster was thus the first to teach the doctrines of an individual judgment, heaven and hell, the future of the resurrection of the body, the general last judgment, and the life of everlasting for the reunited soul and body. These doctrines were to become familiar articles of faith to much of mankind through borrowing by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Yet, it is in Zoroastrianism itself that they have their fullest logical coherence, since Zoroaster insisted both on the goodness of material creation and hence of the physical body, and the unwavering impartiality of divine justice. Just look at that. Just look at it. Interestingly, Magi are also mentioned in the Talmud of what Christians would call the Old Testament, or in Judaism is known as the Torah. And so in the Talmud, they depict Magi as sorcerers and to be, quote, obstructors of the Jewish religion practices. Basically, like the major issue that the people who wrote the Talmud had with Zoroastrian Magi was that they were exhuming a body for a burial ceremony, which was unacceptable for the Jewish sages. And there also was mentions in the Talmud that it was forbidden for a Jewish scholar to learn from a Magi. And I just think that's so funny. Yeah, anyway, another really interesting aspect to the word Magi is that over time the word Magi kind of took on other meanings that were like slightly xenophobic. And so like as the Arabic Caliphate started colonizing the Iranian area, Magi were often, Magi were often called Majus, which meant magician. And it also directly translates into meaning fire worshiper, which is kind of like the equivalent of calling someone like a pagan, right? Like in the Roman tradition, anyone who wasn't Christian was a pagan. And so, of course, through the Islamic tradition, there was like a similar thing happening where anyone who wasn't Islamic was like a fire worshiper. But it is thought that that term fire worshiper, it refers specifically to Zoroastrians and then eventually just to kind of like anyone who was practicing an older religion. And so, again, in this Islamic tradition, they would sometimes use the word Magus, which is meant fire worshiper, to describe Vikings, and literally like any pagan group, quote unquote. Also, interestingly, that during a lot of propaganda used during the Iran-Iraq war during the 1980s, the term Magus started being used once again to describe Iranians, claiming that they were like, quote, not sincere Muslims, and that they still practiced pre-Islamic beliefs in their culture and in their tradition. And in some parts of the Islamic world, the word Magus is used as a derogatory term, specifically towards Shia Muslims, which I think is really interesting. And like, this is something I really dislike about Abrahamic religions. It's like when you call someone like a witch or a sorcerer, it's like supposed to be bad. And it's like, yeah, like what? To be powerful enough to like do sorcery means that you're powerful enough to channel energies through you. And of course there's like ways to do dark magic, but like what if that actually means that you're just ascended? Like you're just a hater, dude. Also, interesting fun fact that in India there's a certain group of Brahmin, which is the highest caste. They are the like quote like priestly caste, and this particular group of Brahmin is known as the Sakaldvipya, and they are considered to be direct descendants of 10 Maga. And these 10 Maga were priests who were invited to conduct worship of a god named Mitra. And Mitra was a god of the sun, known to be a principal guardian of truth and order, according to the Mahabharata. So it's very like, you can really like smell the similarities here. The word Maga sounds exactly like Magi. Also, interestingly, in Spanish, the word Maga does mean magician. And of course, this god Mitra, the god of the sun and the principal guardian of truth and order. I mean, this sounds a lot like Ahura Mazda, of course. Also, I didn't really know this, but there are some surviving priesthoods of Zoroastrianism in both Iran and India. And of course, the practice of Zoroastrianism at one point spread all the way into parts of Greece and parts of Africa. However, today it is not known of a large groups of people who practice. However, the impact of Zoroastrianism did affect how people practice their modern day religions, whether they know it or not. And a big one being that a lot of their buildings then became used for either mosques or churches, which I find really, really interesting. And sorry, I think it's time to have a sip of water. I'm just talking a mile a minute right now. Let's have some water, everyone. Okay, so like I mentioned, Zoroastrianism got like super, super big. And then at one point, like things in the ancient world started changing. And a big one had a lot to do with how big the Persian Empire got. And of course, this is the story older than time. Once a kingdom gets massive, usually the outskirts of that kingdom, they start being colonized themselves, usually by the cultures that they colonized. It's the age-old tale. So the story goes that the biggest collection of manuscripts and scriptures of Zoroastrianism were kept in a library in Persepolis, which is a city in modern-day Iran. And this royal library was eventually destroyed and burned to the ground by Alexander the Great. And due to the invasion of Alexander the Great, it eradicated the richest collection of their texts. And his invasion also began what is called the Hellenistic period of the Persian world. And so, of course, a lot of new beliefs were being introduced into the area. Pieces of the Roman culture and the Greek culture and Christianity started to kind of come on the rise not long after. And so there started to be more mixing of beliefs. And into late antiquity, Zoroastrianism became commonly practiced in Armenia and Egypt. And due to its similarities with Christianity, specifically with the respects to charity and this idea of this like bright light consciousness, which is super similar to Christ consciousness, Christianity became like an easy addition to areas that were already Zoroastrian. It almost became like an easy, it's like an add-on, and so places, Armenia, for example, was the first country to declare itself a Christian nation. And I think a big part of that was that their people were already practicing Zoroastrianism, and so Christianity kind of inlaid itself perfectly as just kind of like adding like a second prophet kind of into the mix, if you will. And so now as history continues, it was in the 7th century, so this is truly like about 1,100 years after Zoroastrianism started becoming popular. The world of ancient Persia was conquered by the emerging Muslim caliphate. And it took about 16 years, which is nothing. So like in 16 years, the cultures of the Arab Peninsula really went to work and colonized a huge portion of Persia. And of course, Iran is kind of like the country, the center point of Persia, and is directly above the Arab Peninsula. So Iran was heavily colonized by the Muslim Caliphate. And of course, as they started being colonized, there was Zoroastrians everywhere. I mean, anywhere you threw a rock, you'd hit a Zoroastrian. And so at first they were generally safe and their lives were fairly unchanged, especially people that lived in more rural areas. But of course, they had to pay an extra tax known as the jizya. And this was a thing that was very common in all parts of the world, regardless of like who was colonizing them. Often cultures would impose their religion, and if you would not convert, then you were required to pay an extra tax. And there was also in the Muslim Caliphate a series of laws known as Dimhi laws, and these basically were laws that kept you in a lower status as long as you didn't convert to Islam. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there was the fateful day, the symbolic day, where the Caliph had the famous cypress of Kashmir, this legendary tree that had been planted in front of the first fire temple. This tree was cut and used to build the new palace in Baghdad, which had become the new capital of the Muslim Caliphate. And so through this time, Zoroastrian buildings were either being taken down or they were being converted into mosques. And like I mentioned, these Tower of Silences, which had once been used for bodies to be eaten by vultures, started being used to hold the call for prayer. And, life became increasingly harder for non-Muslims in this part of the world. And so through the next few hundred years, many people started converting. First, people who were higher ranking in society, because it became almost impossible to do business or maintain property because of these taxes. And then eventually lower class citizens started converting as well, simply because life was so much easier after converting. There was also stories in more rural areas of people being a little more fickle and not wanting to convert. And so there was like generals and high-ranking Muslims that would pay commoners 2 dirhams to attend Friday prayer. So like at this point, you're getting paid to be Muslim. So it just, after a couple of generations, people just kind of started forgetting and started practicing Islam. But through this time, there were people who were adamant to maintain their faith of Zoroastrianism, and a big portion of those people chose to migrate. A large portion migrated to India, and specifically the state of Gujarat, and the descendants of these people are known today as Parsis. And the other group of people were known to have migrated through the great salt deserts of Yazd and Kerman, and these people live in these modern-day provinces of Iran. And allegedly today there are about 60,000 practicing Zoroastrians in Iran and about 70,000 practicing Zoroastrians in India, as well as other minorities in other parts of the world, such as the US and Australia and England. But most of those people are either Indian or Iranian and having brought their culture with them. However, if you pay attention, oh, there are the peppers. I was wondering when you guys were gonna come. If you pay attention in many parts of modern day Iran and modern day Persia, places like Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Turkey, Libya, Egypt, if you pay attention, there are some existing buildings of these Zoroastrians that have been used and repurposed for other religious buildings. And there also are remnants of the Zoroastrian culture that are still practiced in many festivals and in the Abrahamic religions themselves. Of course, things have changed over time through both culture and the differences in the religious texts, but there are a lot of meat of Zoroastrianism that created a precedent that are still practiced to this day. And yeah, I'm honestly super inspired by Zoroastrianism, and I feel that I feel like a sense of sadness, how easily and how quickly a group of people, a religion can be forgotten, and it's kind of like intense actually, because with the Zoroastrian belief of like the primordial dance between light and destruction, creativity and destruction, and how Zoroastrianism was dismantled through like brute power and taxing, like they stopped practicing because it made their lives so much harder due to a law that was ordained by a colonizing force. Like that's actually like, it kind of like plays into this allegory, and yeah, I mean, just for the record, I'm not against or for any religion, because I do think that almost all religions do speak on beautiful ideals. But I am very weary of large organized groups of human beings, because usually power becomes perverted. Someone decides to take their position into a tyrannical quest for power. And it has a legacy that lives thousands of years. And here we are in the year 2024, and there are still wars being waged and bombs being dropped. And like, it's just so crazy, because the religions that people are practicing tell them not to do it. Like this would almost be easier to believe if religions were like, yeah, like kill and murder to your heart's content. Then I could at least like understand people's mentality. But I think something so much bigger is at play, and I do really appreciate how Zoroastrianism phrases it, which is like there's this never-ending primordial dance of creativity and destruction, and it's your personal choice on a moment-to-moment basis of how you choose to perpetuate this primordial dance. It's not about good or evil. It's about like, do you want to be an individual that propels creation, or an individual that propels destruction? And like deceit and wrath and greed are a part of destruction. And honestly, I mean, I don't think I could have said it any better. But it also helps me stay in compassion, because I don't want to send hate to any group or any person. I really do believe that every human at their core is desperately seeking safety and seeking love. And, I just know how traumatizing planet Earth can be, because humans can be so cruel. So I really do believe that most people, even the people doing the most like horrific acts, are probably acting from a place of survival and desperately needing to, in their mind, like defend themselves from whatever they think is out to get them, So anyway, those are just my thoughts. I'm super inspired by this. I think it's super cool stuff. And there's a full moon coming up in about a week, so maybe it would be a good time to have like a little fire ritual and like offer some water to the fire. And I hope this inspires you to think about your ancestors on Earth, and like what kind of beliefs did they have, and how did that shape the areas they lived, and how did it shape the progression of your family, regardless of whoever your family is or whatever religion, like who was your family 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and how did their decisions as individuals shape the world and shape human society and shape you? Those are interesting thoughts to ponder. So I will leave you with that. I hope you have a beautiful day, and I hope you take extra good care of yourself. We all deserve serenity, peace, and health, and that is my wish for you, my dear friend. Over and out, baby.